I spent my whole life raising my children. Yet on my 77th birthday, I stood in front of a crowded party and realized they had betrayed me, lied to me, sold me out for money. I revealed the evidence exposing all their dirty secrets before the entire village, watching shock and desperation in the eyes of those who once called me mother. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next powerful films. Dawn crept gently over Blue Springs Village, shrouding the sleepy houses in a thin golden mist. At the very end of Main Street, where the old maples bowed over the cracked pavement and the river's breath curled above the reeds, stood the Tran family manor, a relic from another age, its once proud facade now softened by decades of rain and memory. Inside the house was alive with ghosts. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, scattering colored gems across the hardwood floors. The scent of old books and faded lilacs lingered in the air, clinging stubbornly to velvet curtains and the heavy wood banisters. On the walls, photographs told a silent history. Sepia portraits of stern great-grandparents, a laughing couple beneath a cherry tree, children lined up in Sunday best on the manor steps. Evelyn Tran woke before the sun as she always had. The habit was a vestige of her years as a teacher, a time when she ruled a bustling classroom, not these shadowed halls. She lay for a moment listening the hum of the old fridge, the tick of the grandfather clock, the hush of wind at the eaves. Her fingers drifted to the small silver frame on her nightstand. It held her and Henry young and invincible on their wedding day, caught forever in the soft focus of memory. She pressed the photo gently to her chest before setting it aside and swinging her feet onto the cold floor. She moved through the quiet house with a practiced grace, opening shutters, checking for new cracks in the ceiling, setting the kettle on the stove. In the garden, robins hopped among wild violets, scattering dew. The rose bushes grew wild now, but she rather liked their stubborn defiance. She set the breakfast table just as she always had her grandmother's china, a cup of black tea, a slice of yesterday's lemon pound cake. She was halfway through her tea when she heard a brisk knock at the front door, sharp against the early quiet. She glanced at the clock. Not quite 7 a.m. Too early for Mrs. Baker next door, too late for the mailman. Evelyn smoothed her housecoat and went to the door, a flicker of hope and dread mingling in her chest. On the porch stood her son, Kevin Tran, tall, handsome, dressed in a pressed suit that looked out of place in their sleepy village. His smile was wide, practiced, the kind he used in business meetings. Beside him, his younger sister Linda balanced her purse and white coat, her phone already out as she answered an early morning text. Her stethoscope peeked out from her bag, a quiet badge of pride and distance. "Morning, Mom," Kevin said, stepping past her into the foyer with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Brought you pastries from that place in the city you like. Hope you're hungry." Linda followed, barely glancing up. "How did you sleep, Mom?" "You really should let us get you that adjustable bed I mentioned. It's so much better for your joints. Or I could write you a prescription for something stronger." Evelyn tried to smile to muster the warmth she used to feel when her children came home. "I sleep just fine, Linda. Come in, both of you. The tea is still hot." They sat in the kitchen, Kevin at the head of the table, Linda beside him, Evelyn across from them, feeling like an intruder at her own breakfast. Kevin opened the pastry box, offering a croissant with the air of someone presenting a contract. "Eat, Mom. You look thin. Are you eating enough?" Evelyn poured the tea, steadying her hand. "I get by. I'm not as hungry as I used to be." Linda's eyes flickered over the room, taking inventory. "This house is so big for just one person. And these stairs, I don't know how you manage them every day. Have you thought more about what we suggested?" Kevin jumped in the edge of impatience barely concealed in his voice. "You know, Mom, there's that new senior community near my place, gated with staff on call 24/7. They have all these activities and social clubs. You'd never be alone. Wouldn't that be nice?" Evelyn kept her gaze on her tea. She knew this conversation had endured it in a dozen forms over the years. "I'm fine here. I like the peace and quiet. and I have everything I need. Linda smiled tightly. We just worry about you, Mom. If something happened, if you fell or there was an emergency. There's a call button in every room there, Kevin pressed. It'd give us so much peace of mind. And honestly, Mom, keeping up this old place can't be easy. Roof's been leaking, hasn't it? You're always calling about the plumbing, the furnace. Why not let us handle it? If you sell the manor, you could live comfortably anywhere you want. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in with each word. Evelyn thought of the years spent saving for this house, the memories embedded in every cracked tile and squeaky step. Her husband's laughter in the hall, her children's muddy shoes by the door Christmases and graduations and long summer evenings when the world seemed so much bigger than it does now. She drew a steadying breath. Your father and I built our lives here. I'm not ready to leave, not yet. Kevin set his cup down a little too hard. We're just thinking of what's best for you, Mom. You shouldn't be stubborn about this. It's not safe. Linda nodded, but her gaze slid away. Breakfast continued in uneasy silence, the air thick with things unsaid. Evelyn forced herself to eat the croissant, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. Her children talked softly between themselves about real estate values, upkeep costs, the responsibility of old houses. Pretending not to notice the tears, she blinked back. When they stood to leave, Kevin kissed her cheek businesslike. Think about what we said, Mom. It'd really put our minds at ease. Linda hugged her briefly, already checking her phone again. We'll call you tonight, okay? The front door closed behind them, their car purring away down Main Street. For a moment, Evelyn stood in the silence, feeling the chill creep back in. She wandered to the living room, drawn to the old mantel where her wedding photo stood. Henry's eyes, frozen in time, watched her with that gentle, knowing patience she missed so much. She pressed a trembling hand to the frame. I don't know how much longer I can do this, she whispered. They want me out, Henry. They want what's left. No answer but the slow, steady tick of the clock. Outside, the day had fully arrived. Blue Springs Village was waking dogs, barking children, shouting, the baker's truck rumbling up the lane. Evelyn stayed at the window, watching life unfold, separated from it by layers of glass, memory, and regret. She looked down at her gnarled hands, then back up at the portrait. I'm not ready to leave. Not for them, not for anyone. The first light brushed her face, and for a fleeting moment, she was young again, standing with Henry in the garden, the manor bright and new behind them, the whole world open. But the moment passed, and she was alone with her fears once more, holding on as always for just one more day. The morning after Kevin and Linda's visit, the house seemed to settle back into uneasy silence, as if it had exhaled some hidden tension once the front door had closed behind them. But for Evelyn Tran, the stillness was different now, edged with unease. It lingered with her as she moved through the empty rooms, replaying the conversation over in her mind, trying to decipher what lay beneath her children's gentle voices and forced concern. By noon, the manor was awash in late spring sunlight, but Evelyn could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. The kitchen smelled faintly of Kevin's aftershave. Linda's perfume clung to the hallways, but the comfort they once brought her had soured into a sort of dread. The house felt heavier, the floors creaked louder, and the shadows beneath the stairs seemed to lengthen as if warning her to stay vigilant. She tidied the kitchen as usual, but her hands trembled just enough to make the teacups rattle. When she looked up, she caught her own reflection in the window, an old woman, yes, but one with sharp, searching eyes. She pressed her lips together, told herself she was being paranoid, that she was reading too much into her children's words. And yet, late that afternoon, as Evelyn was sweeping the front porch, she caught the low rumble of voices drifting from the garden path. She paused, her broom frozen mid-sweep. Kevin and Linda stood by the hydrangeas, unaware that their voices carried through the open windows. She heard her name then, a flurry of words she couldn't quite catch. She moved closer, the sweep of the broom muffling her footsteps. She'll never agree if we ask her outright, Kevin's voice, a mixture of annoyance and calculation. She's stubborn, always has been. Linda's reply was sharper than Evelyn was used to hearing. We don't have time to wait for her to come around. The longer she stays here, the more problems. It's not safe, not practical, and you know it." There was a pause. The birds in the trees fell silent, as if eavesdropping. "We need to make her see reason," Kevin said, lowering his voice. "If we can get her to sign, we can list the property and settle everything before summer ends. If not," Linda cut him off, frustration clear. "If not, we're stuck. And so is she. I can't keep coming down here every weekend pretending everything's fine. My schedule's a mess already." Kevin let out a bitter laugh. "You think I enjoy this? You know what my financial situation is like. I can't keep juggling this much longer." There was a rustle, the sound of Linda fidgeting with her phone. "What about Sophie? She's close to Grandma. If we can get her on our side." "No," Kevin said firmly. "Sophie's too attached. She'll only make things harder. We keep her out of it." The conversation dissolved into silence, punctuated only by the distant bark of a dog and the drone of bees in the garden. Evelyn retreated quickly, heart pounding in her chest, broom forgotten. The words clattered in her mind, sign property stuck attached. For the first time she allowed herself to consider what she had feared all along. Her children were not simply concerned, they were plotting. The realization cut deeper than she cared to admit, but she steeled herself, forced her breath to steady. That evening, as twilight crept through the house, Sophie arrived. Her footsteps on the stone path were light, her knock gentle, nothing like the impatient, businesslike raps of her father or aunt. Sophie, her granddaughter, the gentle soul who spent weekends at the manor when she could always, with a new book in hand or a story to tell about college life. She was a bright spot in Evelyn's world, a reminder that not all family ties are tangled by greed. Grandma Sophie called, peeking into the kitchen. "In here, honey," Evelyn replied, a smile blooming on her lips in spite of herself. Sophie stepped inside, the early evening sunlight catching the copper strands in her hair. She dropped her bag by the door and crossed the room to hug Evelyn, squeezing tightly the way she had since she was a child. "I brought you some lemon cookies," Sophie announced, pulling a small tin from her tote. "Made them in my dorm's kitchen. I think I finally got the recipe right." Evelyn laughed, her tension melting for a moment. "You always get it right, darling. You're the only one who bakes with enough butter." They settled at the table, cookies and tea between them. Sophie filled the room with stories, professors she admired, friends she worried about, plans for a summer internship at the community center in town. Her presence warmed the kitchen, chasing away the shadows that had gathered in Evelyn's mind. "Are you all right, Grandma?" Sophie asked suddenly, concern flickering in her blue eyes. "You seem distracted." Evelyn hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Just tired, I suppose. Your dad and aunt came by early this morning. Lots of talk about the future." Sophie's face darkened. "I hope they're not bothering you about moving again. You know you don't have to listen to them, Grandma. If you want to stay here, you should stay here." Evelyn patted her granddaughter's hand. "Thank you, Sophie. That means a lot." For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of leaves outside. Evelyn felt for the first time all day that she wasn't completely alone. After Sophie left, promising to return the following weekend, the house seemed to sigh around Evelyn. The daylight faded, and with it the warmth that Sophie had brought. The shadows crept back, pooling in corners and crawling along the hallway like slow, dark water. Night fell swiftly. Evelyn moved through her bedtime routine, a cup of chamomile tea, a book she barely read, a window checked locked. Still, she couldn't shake the sense of unease. The conversation she had overheard replayed itself endlessly in her mind. Her children's voices, cold and transactional, felt like a betrayal she could taste in the back of her throat. She climbed the stairs to her room, switching off lights as she went, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. But when she passed her late husband's study, the room she hadn't entered in weeks, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light shining from beneath. She frowned. She was certain she'd turned off all the lights earlier. For a moment she wondered if Sophie had gone in by mistake or if she herself had forgotten, lost in thought. But something in her gut told her otherwise. She pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking in protest. The room was empty, the light a dull amber from the desk lamp. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and musty books. Her husband's belongings were arranged just as he had left them, a fountain pen on the blotter, a stack of ledgers, his collection of porcelain figurines. Evelyn moved to switch off the lamp, but froze. The top drawer of the desk was open, papers slightly askew. She reached inside, searching. The envelope that had held their marriage certificate gone. The small box of gold coins Henry had collected from his father gone too. She spun around, her eyes darting to the bookshelf, the lacquered box where she kept her mother's jewelry. She opened it, hands trembling. The velvet pouch of jade rings was missing. Her heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo off the walls. She stood in the center of the study, breath coming short and shallow. The rest of the house was silent, so silent she could hear her own heartbeat. She closed the desk drawer, her hands cold and clammy, and stepped out into the hall, switching off the light as she went. But the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. Each shadow seemed to hold secrets. Each creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. Evelyn stood at the foot of the stairs, gripping the banister, and realized that she was not simply being paranoid. She was right to be afraid. She returned to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, though she knew it would do little good. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands, wrinkled, spotted, but steady now with resolve. For a long time she sat in the dark, letting the enormity of what had happened sink in. Her children were plotting against her. Yes, but now someone had crossed a line. Someone had violated the one sacred place she'd kept for herself and her memories. It could have been anyone: Kevin, desperate for cash; Linda, thinking she was doing what was best, even a stranger. But in her heart, Evelyn knew. The conversation she had overheard was no coincidence. This was a plan set in motion by her own flesh and blood. A wave of anger surged up, burning away the last shreds of self-doubt. She would not be a victim in her own home. She would not let them steal her memories, her legacy, the life she and Henry had built together, board by board, year by year. The moon rose high, painting the manor in silver and shadow. Evelyn crossed to her nightstand, pulled out a battered notebook, and began to write. She listed every item missing, every strange conversation, every uneasy feeling. She would keep a record of everything. She turned to the window, gazing out over the garden where the hydrangeas gleamed ghostly blue in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Somewhere closer a floorboard creaked, a house settling, or perhaps something more. Evelyn closed her notebook and set her jaw. She would not let herself be pushed out of her home, not by her children, not by anyone. The manor at Blue Springs was hers, and she would defend it with everything she had left. As the first light of dawn crept over the fields, Evelyn Tran was no longer just a lonely old woman. She was a woman with purpose, with suspicions confirmed, and a plan beginning to take shape. The days of passive acceptance were over. Now she would watch, listen, remember, and fight. The seeds of suspicion had taken root, and Evelyn Tran, against all odds, was ready to dig for the truth. Rain had swept in overnight, tapping insistently at the windows, soaking the gardens, and leaving the old trees glistening in the pale morning light. Evelyn Tran awoke to the scent of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder, her dreams still clinging to her like a chill. But she pushed herself from bed, determined to face the day, determined, if only in small ways, to reclaim some measure of control. She moved through her morning routine with the mechanical grace of someone who had lived 1,000 mornings just like this. But her mind, usually anchored by familiar habits, was adrift, preoccupied with the conversations she'd overheard, the stolen treasures from Henry's study, the shadow that had crept into her home and taken root. She found herself double-checking every door, every drawer, listening for strange sounds as she boiled water for tea. It wasn't just fear that guided her now, it was anger. An anger she hadn't felt in years, simmering beneath the surface, sharp enough to sting. It was still early when the phone rang. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, staring at the old rotary phone as if it were a snake poised to strike. Finally she answered, steeling her voice. "Hello, Mom. Hey, it's me. Kevin." Her son's voice carried its usual note of forced cheer, a little too loud, too bright for the dreary morning. "Good morning, Kevin," she replied, forcing warmth into her tone. He launched right in the way he always did. "I hope I'm not calling too early. I know you're an early riser." A pause. Evelyn could almost hear him rehearsing his lines on the other end. "Listen, Mom, I've hit a bit of a rough patch at work. The economy, you know. Clients are taking longer to pay, deals are slow. It's just a temporary thing, nothing I can't handle. But I was wondering, would you be able to help me out? Just a small loan bridge the gap till the next check comes in." Evelyn's heart clenched. This was not the first time Kevin had called with a story like this. For years she had believed him, had wanted to believe him, had wanted to think she was helping, not enabling. But this time, after everything, after the whispers in the garden, the missing valuables, she listened with a new sense of clarity. "I see," she said, voice carefully neutral. "How much do you need?" "Oh, not much. Just 5,000. Just for a couple weeks, I swear. I'll pay you back as soon as that deal closes. I'd ask the bank, but they're impossible right now. 5,000. She let the number hang in the air, heard it echo through the silent house. "That's a lot of money, Kevin. Are you sure everything's all right?" "Of course, Mom. It's nothing to worry about, just bad timing. If it weren't for the car repairs last month, I'd be fine. I've got some investments coming through big clients. It's just a cash flow thing." She almost laughed at how practiced his excuses sounded, how easy the lies came to him now. "I'll see what I can do," she said quietly. "But Kevin, I need to keep track of these things. I'll need you to write it down. No more just talking about it." A brief pause, then Kevin chuckled as if she'd made a joke. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you want." When the call ended, Evelyn replaced the receiver with shaking hands. She pressed her palms to her temples, trying to drive away the ache blooming behind her eyes. The numbers were starting to pile up in her head, the missing gold coins, the jewelry now $5,000. The math was adding up to something she didn't want to see. A sharp rap at the door startled her. She gathered her robe around her and opened it to find Mrs. Hamilton, her neighbor from across the street, peering in with concern. "Evelyn, I hope I'm not disturbing you. It's just, well, I was at the market yesterday and I ran into an old friend of Kevin's. Thought you'd want to know." Evelyn waved her inside, setting tea for both of them. Mrs. Hamilton never brought idle gossip. Her words always had a reason behind them. As they sipped their tea, Mrs. Hamilton lowered her voice, her gaze intent. "My niece works at the real estate office in town. She mentioned Kevin's been in quite a bit, asking about selling property, talking about loans against family assets. And then there's the card games." Evelyn's breath caught. "Card games?" Mrs. Hamilton nodded almost apologetically. "Kevin's been seen at the casino outside of town. Some people say he owes money quite a bit. I thought you'd want to know before anything else goes missing." Evelyn felt the blood rush from her face. "Thank you, Mabel. You're a good friend." When Mrs. Hamilton left, Evelyn stood for a long moment at the window, staring at the dripping branches, her mind racing. Kevin, her son, the boy who'd once brought her dandelions and promised to buy her a house twice this size, was gambling, was lying, was drowning and dragging her legacy down with him. That afternoon, as Evelyn tried to focus on her needlework, she heard a low murmur in the hallway. She set her sewing aside and crept to the stairs, listening. Down below, Sophie was sitting on the front steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring off into the distance. The girl looked troubled, a storm flickering behind her eyes. From inside the living room, Kevin's voice, lower than usual, impatient. "You keep your mouth shut. Understand? You don't talk to Grandma about this. She doesn't need to worry." Sophie's voice was small, wounded. "Dad, I saw you in her study last night. What were you doing? Why did you take those coins? That box belonged to Grandpa, too." A pause. Evelyn held her breath, every muscle tensed. Kevin's reply was sharp, angry, in a way Evelyn had never heard before. "It's none of your business, Sophie. These are family matters. Sometimes adults have to make tough decisions. You let me handle Grandma. Don't say a word." Sophie burst into tears, dashing inside and slamming her bedroom door. Kevin's footsteps followed the door to his old room, shutting with a finality that made Evelyn flinch. She felt a fresh wave of guilt for letting things get this far, for letting Sophie get caught in the crossfire. Later, Evelyn found Sophie sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Evelyn asked gently, sitting beside her. Sophie shook her head, brushing away tears. "I'm fine, Grandma, just tired." Evelyn wanted to press to ask what was wrong, but Sophie's defenses were up her shoulders, hunched. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her, wishing she could shield her from all the hurts in the world. Night fell heavy that day, rain drumming a steady tattoo against the windows. Evelyn moved through the house, locking doors, checking windows. Her mind was a whirl of anxiety and suspicion. It was as if she were living in someone else's home, a place where every shadow concealed a threat. She found herself lingering by her study, drawn by a sense of unease. The door was ajar, light spilling into the hallway. She stepped inside and froze. Linda was there, crouched by the filing cabinet, her face pale in the lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of paper and dust. Linda Evelyn's voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Linda jumped, slamming the drawer closed. "Mom, you scared me. I was just looking for your health insurance papers. You said you couldn't find them last week." Evelyn nodded, but her eyes went to the pile of folders on the desk. Her will, the deed to the house, the mortgage papers all scattered as if someone had rifled through them. "I can find them myself, thank you," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady. "It's late, Linda. You should get some rest." Linda hesitated, her cheeks flushed. "I just wanted to help. You know how much paperwork you have. It's easy to lose track." Evelyn watched as Linda gathered her things, avoiding her mother's gaze. The moment she was gone, Evelyn locked the study door behind her, her heart hammering. She waited until the house was quiet, until she could hear nothing but the rain. Then she sat at her desk, pulled out her old notebook, the same one she'd written in the night before, and opened it to a fresh page. She began to write. May 14th. Kevin called again this morning asking for money, $5,000 this time. He says it's for work, but I know better now. Mrs. Hamilton told me about the casino, about the debts. I don't know how deep he's in, but I fear it's worse than I can imagine. This afternoon I overheard Sophie and Kevin. She saw him in my study. She's scared. He threatened her. My heart breaks for her, for all of us. How did we get here? Linda was in my study tonight searching for the deed. She says she's helping, but I know what she's really after. I saw the way she looked at those papers. I feel like I'm losing everything. My home, my family, my peace of mind. I won't let them take it. I can't. She stopped, her hand cramping. She looked around the study at the shelves lined with books she'd read and reread over decades, at the faded photographs at the desk that still bore the marks of Henry's pen. She closed the notebook and drew a deep breath, bracing herself. There was no more pretending, no more turning away. The mask had slipped, the cracks were showing, and the ugly truths underneath were crawling out into the light. Evelyn Tran had spent a lifetime building this home, loving her children, hoping for their best. But now she saw them, truly saw them, not as the hopeful children she'd once rocked to sleep, but as desperate adults, frightened and flawed, circling her like wolves. She would not be easy prey. The rain slowed, the thunder rolling farther into the distance. Evelyn got up, locked the study, and walked the halls of her home one last time before bed, her footsteps steady, her jaw set. Tonight she would sleep with the doors locked, the notebook tucked beneath her pillow. Tomorrow she would begin to fight for her home, for Sophie, for the memory of the life she and Henry had built. And she would not back down, not now, not ever. Morning in Blue Springs brought a brittle chill, a wind that crept beneath the doors and made the manor's ancient beams groan. Evelyn Tran wrapped herself in her thickest cardigan, feeling every year of her age, but her eyes sharp. Restless, were more alive than they had been in months. She was done waiting for fate to decide her future. Today she would seek help. She dialed the number, carefully double-checking the faded ink in her address book. The phone rang twice. Then a warm baritone answered. "This is Daniel Huang." "Daniel," she said, letting the name settle in her mouth like an old prayer. "It's Evelyn Tran. I hope this isn't a bad time." Daniel's voice brightened the years folding away. Mrs. Tran, my favorite teacher. My goodness, I haven't heard your voice since my mother's funeral. Are you all right? I'm not sure I am. Evelyn replied, her words trembling between pride and fear. Can you come by the house? I need to talk to you about family matters and legal questions. Of course. I'll be there in an hour. Daniel said, no hesitation, no questions. Just the sure loyalty of a man raised with respect. Evelyn hung up, surprised at the relief that surged in her chest. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, the ritual soothing. She could feel the house breathing, with her old walls flexing as if bracing for the storm to come. When Daniel arrived, he filled the foyer with presence. He was taller now, heavier at the jaw, but the same quick wit danced in his eyes. He greeted Evelyn like family, his hands gentle as he took hers in greeting. You still make the best coffee in the county. He grinned, settling at her kitchen table as if no time had passed. Evelyn tried to smile, but her hands trembled as she slid a yellowed envelope across the table. Notes, receipts, a worn checkbook, her notebook of missing valuables. Daniel, I need your help. Something is very wrong in this house. She explained everything. Kevin's mounting requests for money, the missing coins, the fights between the siblings, Linda's search through her papers, the rumors from Mrs. Hamilton, the late-night quarrels she heard echoing up the stairs. All of it poured out of her, sharp-edged and raw. Daniel listened, his expression darkening. He flipped through the papers, eyes scanning with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to follow money where it didn't want to be found. You did the right thing, Mrs. Tran. You kept records. Most people don't. He pointed at the notebook. I'll need copies of these pages and your permission to pull property records, bank statements, anything you're willing to share. If your children are forging your signature or misusing your assets, I can find it. Evelyn nodded, the relief nearly bringing her to tears. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. They spent the afternoon in the dining room, Daniel's laptop humming quietly, Evelyn providing dates, names, little details she'd stowed away in the corners of her memory. She marveled at how methodical he was, checking county records, searching through state databases, making phone calls in rapid, hushed Vietnamese when English seemed too exposed. With every new folder, Evelyn felt herself both frightened and empowered. She was staring into the dark, but at least she wasn't doing it alone. Sophie came by in the early afternoon, her college backpack slung over one shoulder, her face pale and drawn. She paused at the threshold, unsure, but Daniel called her in. Sophie, right? You look just like your grandmother did first year in high school. Same stubborn chin. Evelyn reached out for Sophie's hand, needing its warmth. Sweetheart, this is Daniel. He's helping me look into some family business. I'd like you to trust him. Sophie's eyes darted between her grandmother and the lawyer, searching for answers. She sat biting her lip, fingers tangled in her sweater. Dad's been acting strange, she said quietly. He stays up late on the phone, sometimes leaves the house for hours. I heard him and Aunt Linda arguing about paperwork last night. Something about the house, about getting things sorted before Grandma can change her mind. Daniel took notes, his questions gentle but direct. Have you seen any documents? Contracts? Did they mention a buyer? Sophie shook her head but then hesitated. A few days ago, Dad asked if I knew where Grandma kept her passport, and I saw Aunt Linda with a folder of papers she wouldn't let me see. Evelyn squeezed Sophie's hand. You've done nothing wrong, sweetheart. But if you see or hear anything else, you tell me or Daniel. Don't confront your father or your aunt. Not yet. Promise me. Sophie nodded, her voice a whisper. I promise. Daniel packed up his laptop, the kitchen table now cluttered with files, printouts, Evelyn's neat handwriting on yellow legal pads. He looked at the two women, serious now, every trace of the jovial student gone. I can already see signs of financial distress. Kevin's bank account has repeated cash withdrawals, some tied to a casino. There are inquiries from a real estate agent someone tried to pull the title history for this house. That would require either your authorization, Mrs. Tran, or a forged signature. Evelyn's mouth went dry. So it's true then. They're planning to sell. Daniel nodded. or at least leverage the property for a loan. I'll run a full check on all recorded liens. I also want you to secure your important documents, passport, birth certificate, the original deed, somewhere they can't reach. Upstairs, a door slammed. Tension snapped through the air, taut as piano wire. Down the hall, Kevin's voice, frantic, angry, cut through the hush. "Where did you put the deed, Linda? You said you had it. We can't stall the buyer forever." Linda hissed, her words ragged. "She's hiding things, Kevin. She knows. You should never have let Sophie see you in the study." Sophie flinched, shrinking back, but Evelyn drew her close. The sound of their voices burned in the air, undeniable now. The siblings were turning on each other, suspicion and fear bubbling up. In another room, Evelyn could hear the muffled sound of Kevin dialing a number, leaving an agitated voicemail. Daniel glanced at Evelyn, his expression grim. "They're desperate. Desperate people do reckless things. But you have the advantage, records, evidence, witnesses. You stay calm, keep documenting everything." The kitchen felt like a war room strategy, and secrecy layered over the smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee. Outside, a storm brewed in the late afternoon thunder echoing down Main Street. Evelyn watched the sky turn gunmetal, the manor groaning in the wind. In the fading light, Sophie slipped away upstairs. Not 5 minutes later, she returned, cheeks flushed, breathless. She held out a small thumb drive. "I found this in Dad's desk. He's been using it for everything: scanned documents, emails, even voice memos." Daniel took the drive with a look of admiration. "You're brave, Sophie. This might be exactly what we need." They plugged it into Daniel's laptop. Folders upon folders appeared, some labeled with innocuous titles, others simply marked "Urgent, Confidential Cell." Daniel's fingers flew over the keyboard. Scans of Evelyn's signature, some slightly altered. Emails between Kevin and a realtor in the city referencing expedited sale family, unable to manage property, liquidate assets. There were voice recordings, too, a clipped conversation between Kevin and a man named Alex about repaying debts using the old house as collateral if necessary. Evelyn felt a sickening twist in her gut, but she was grateful for the truth. Thunder rattled the windows. Upstairs, footsteps, Kevin and Linda arguing their words, hissing and sharp. "You said Mom would sign by now. If she stalls, we lose everything. Don't blame me. You're the one who lost the coins, let Sophie snoop around. This is your fault, not mine." The fractures between them grew with every minute. Daniel copied the thumb drive to his own. "This is enough to freeze any unauthorized sale, maybe even file a police report if it comes to that. But it's not just about stopping them, Mrs. Tran. It's about protecting yourself. Until we're ready, you act as if nothing's changed. Don't confront them. Let them believe you're in the dark. That's our best advantage." Evelyn nodded, mind racing. "How long do we wait?" Daniel put a hand over hers, solid and reassuring. "Not long. I want to get everything in order. Witness statements, financial records, legal protections. The more desperate they get, the more likely they'll slip. And when they do, we'll be ready. For now, document everything. Keep Sophie safe, and if anything scares you, you call me, day or night." For a long moment, the three of them sat in silence, the storm outside matching the turmoil in Evelyn's heart. For the first time, the old house did not feel lonely. It felt alive with purpose, with allies, with hope. She was not alone. Sophie was not alone. As Daniel gathered his things and prepared to leave, he turned back to Evelyn, his face kind but steeled. "You taught me never to back down from a fight, Mrs. Tran. Now I'm here for you. We'll get through this, but you have to be patient." Evelyn smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with gratitude and something harder like resolve. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." As dusk settled over Blue Springs, thunder rolling into the distance, Evelyn watched Daniel's car disappear down the lane. She stood by the window, the shadows gathering at her feet, and realized for the first time in weeks she felt almost safe. Not because the danger had passed, but because she finally had someone on her side. And so the war for the manor would go on, but now the odds were different. Now she was no longer defenseless. She was armed with evidence, with allies, with the hope of justice on her side. Somewhere upstairs, Kevin and Linda's voices raged and faltered, two masks cracking under the weight of greed and fear. Evelyn took out her notebook and wrote a single line, "I am not alone. I am ready." The storm outside finally broke, lashing the windows with rain wind whistling down the chimney, as if the old manor itself were protesting the battle raging within its walls. Evelyn Tran sat alone in the parlor, hands trembling as she arranged her late husband's favorite chess pieces, a habit she'd taken up again in the sleepless nights since suspicion entered her home. Each click of ceramic on wood was a stalling tactic, an attempt to summon courage for what she sensed was coming. It didn't take long. The heavy tread of her son's footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and impatient. Kevin Tran entered the room, shoulders squared, as if he'd already decided not to leave until he'd gotten what he wanted. He shut the parlor door behind him with a snap. "Mom, we need to talk now." Evelyn glanced up, meeting his gaze with quiet caution. "Of course, Kevin. What's so urgent?" He dropped a sheaf of papers onto the coffee table, his hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the chill in the room. "These, I need you to sign. Today. We've been patient, but this can't wait anymore." She looked down at the document's pages and pages highlighted, tabbed, full of legal language and realtors' logos. "What are these?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "It's the sale paperwork," Kevin replied, jaw clenched. "All you have to do is sign. You know as well as I do this house is too much for you. The offer's more than fair. If you stall, the buyers will walk. And then where will we be?" Evelyn's hands curled into fists. "I told you. I'm not ready to sell. This is my home, Kevin. Your father," he cut her off, voice rising. "Dad's gone. He'd want what's best for you, and what's best is to stop clinging to the past. You're not thinking straight, Mom. You're not being reasonable." She looked at him then, not as her son, but as the man he'd become, desperate, cold, a tremor of greed shining in his eyes. "What's really going on, Kevin? Why are you pushing so hard?" He faltered just a flicker before anger surged back in its place. "Don't start, Mom. I have enough on my plate. The world's changing, the market's good now, but it won't last. Why not make it easy for all of us? Sign the papers." She shook her head firm. "No." For a moment, silence. Then Kevin's temper snapped, the mask gone. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Don't blame me when you regret it." Evelyn's breath came shallow. "Is that a threat?" He didn't answer, just gathered the papers in a rough sweep and stormed out the slam of the door, rattling the family portraits on the wall. Alone. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer. She stared at the chessboard, the king caught in a ring of pawns, and thought how quickly the game had changed. Upstairs, Linda Tran had watched her brother's retreat with narrowed eyes. The confrontation had left her shaken, but also opened a door a chance. She waited until she heard Evelyn's slow footsteps on the stairs, waited until she saw her mother's exhaustion, then swooped in, gentle as silk. Mom Linda appeared in the doorway to Evelyn's room, her face soft, her voice honeyed. "You look tired. Why don't you let me help you with those bills? I know how complicated everything can get. Why don't we go over a few forms together just to make sure everything's in order?" Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her robe close. "I'm fine, Linda. I'm not signing anything tonight." Linda's smile didn't waver. "No pressure. Just read them over with me. I'm only looking out for you, you know that. Maybe there's something you missed, something important for your health insurance or the property taxes." She fanned out a small stack of documents, the top one innocuously titled Authorization for Representation, another title verification. Beneath more paperwork, dense legalese designed to exhaust and confuse. Evelyn's eyes blurred, fatigue and fear mingling, as Linda explained, voice soothing, that all you need to do is initial here and sign here. Linda even offered her own pen blue ink already uncapped. Just as Evelyn reached for the pen, Sophie appeared in the doorway. The sight of her granddaughter, pale and urgent, jolted her awake. "Grandma, can I talk to you?" Sophie's eyes flicked to the papers, to her aunt, and then back to Evelyn. "Now, please," Linda tried to intervene. "Sophie, not now. We're handling something important." But Sophie stood her ground. "It's important, Grandma, please." Evelyn pushed herself up with an effort, ignoring Linda's look of irritation. In the hallway, Sophie closed the door behind them. "Don't sign anything," Sophie whispered fiercely. "I heard Dad on the phone. He said if you sign, the house will be gone in days. Aunt Linda's in on it too. They're desperate, Grandma. Please don't let them trick you." Evelyn squeezed Sophie's hand, gratitude and pain mixing in her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. I was so tired I almost— Thank you." Back in her room, Linda was waiting, mask of concern cracking just slightly. "Changed your mind?" she asked, hope flickering in her voice. Evelyn shook her head, firm now. "No, not tonight." Linda's lips thinned. "We're trying to help you. You'll see." But the gentle threat in her voice lingered, souring the air. For the next few days, the tension was a living thing creeping through the house. Kevin paced the halls, snapping at Sophie, making terse calls behind closed doors. Linda hovered, polite and insistent, always with a new form to review, always a fresh smile that never reached her eyes. Evelyn felt herself shrinking, her sleep restless, her meals untouched, her heart pounding with each knock on the door. Sophie shadowed her grandmother as best she could, intercepting paperwork, accidentally spilling tea on forged forms, hiding the house keys when Kevin demanded them. She watched her father with sorrow, saw the lines of worry deepen around his mouth, the way he flinched when the phone rang. At night, she listened to her aunt and father argue, voices sharp as broken glass. Finally, one afternoon, it all came to a head. Kevin cornered Evelyn in the study, eyes wild, papers in hand. "This is your last chance, Mom. You sign now or what, Kevin?" Her voice was soft, but steel glinted beneath. He hesitated, then exploded. "You're ruining everything. Do you know what I'm risking? I'm doing this for us, for you. Don't you see that?" Evelyn's vision swam. "Get out," she managed, clutching the desk for support. Linda appeared at the door, panic in her eyes. "Kevin, stop it. You're scaring her." But it was too late. Evelyn's knees buckled. The room spun. Sophie, who had heard the shouting, ran in just in time to catch her as she collapsed. "Grandma, Grandma!" Sophie's voice rose in terror as Evelyn slid to the floor, eyes fluttering closed. "Call 911, Linda shouted, but her hands shook as she dialed. Time blurred sirens. Strangers in uniforms. Questions that Evelyn could barely answer. Sophie never left her side, clutching her grandmother's hand, whispering prayers into the hospital's cold, bright air. Night fell. Sophie sat in the dark beside Evelyn's bed, tears streaking her cheeks, one hand gripping her grandmother's frail fingers, the other twisting the silver ring Evelyn had given her for graduation. She remembered every story Evelyn had told her, every lesson in kindness, every holiday spent under the old manor's roof. She remembered, too, the terror of nearly losing her, of realizing how easily something precious could be stolen by those who should have loved best. When Evelyn woke, it was morning again, light pale and cold at the edge of the window. Her head throbbed, but her eyes were clear, sharp. She saw Sophie's worried face, Linda asleep in a plastic chair, Kevin pacing the hallway outside. Sophie bent close, voice thick with tears and relief. "Grandma, you're okay. You're really okay." Evelyn squeezed her granddaughter's hand, feeling resolve kindle like a flame inside her chest. She would not let this be the end. She would not let her life, her home, her family's story be written by greed or cowardice. She would fight not only for herself, but for Sophie, for Henry, for all the Tran generations before and after. As the nurse came in and Sophie stood to let her work, Evelyn looked out at the gray dawn and set her jaw. She was not broken. She was reborn, ready for battle. And from that moment on, every day was a new line drawn in the sand. No more fear, no more surrender. The Tran family had declared war, but Evelyn Tran was not about to lose her kingdom without a fight. The first thing Evelyn Tran saw when she opened her eyes was Sophie slumped over the side of the hospital bed, her head resting on folded arms, a single streak of sunlight tangled in her hair. There was a moment, weightless, silent, when Evelyn couldn't remember why she was here, what had brought her to this cold white room with its mechanical beeps and antiseptic smell. Then it all came flooding back, the shouting, the pressure, the way her body simply gave out, as if the old manor's walls had finally collapsed around her heart. She shifted on the stiff mattress, wincing, and Sophie jolted awake, blinking away the remnants of a sleepless night. Grandma Sophie breathed, voice thick with relief. "You're awake. You're really awake." Evelyn managed a smile, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. Still here, she croaked, her throat raw, but there was warmth in her eyes. "You didn't have to stay all night, honey." Sophie wiped her eyes, smiling through tears. "I couldn't leave you. I was so scared. Aunt Linda kept saying you'd be fine, but Dad..." Her words faltered, and Evelyn felt a swell of gratitude and guilt all at once. "Shh, it's all right," she murmured, brushing a stray hair from Sophie's cheek. "You're my brave girl. You always have been." A gentle knock broke the hush. Daniel Huang stepped in, briefcase in hand, his suit rumpled, but his face alight with determination. He greeted Evelyn with a hug, gentle, careful of the IV taped to her wrist. "Mrs. Tran, you had us worried," Daniel said, settling beside the bed. "But you look better already." "That's a relief." Evelyn tried to laugh, though it came out thin. "It takes more than a family feud to finish me off, Daniel." He offered her a sheaf of documents carefully clipped together. "And you were right to be strong. I've finished what we discussed. You have more friends in Blue Springs than you realize, people who care. People who have seen things, heard things. You're not alone." He laid out the evidence. Financial records, emails, the thumb drive Sophie had risked so much to retrieve, sworn statements from neighbors who had witnessed Kevin's late-night visits to the casino, bank transfers to Linda, marked with vague explanations, suspicious signatures. Each page was a weight lifted, a line drawn between Evelyn's life and the wolves circling just beyond it. "I took it to a judge in town," a friend Daniel explained. "He says you have enough to freeze any property transaction, more than enough for a criminal case if you choose to file it. For now, no one can sell the manor or take out loans against it. You're safe. Legally, they can't touch you." Relief rushed through Evelyn, so intense she thought she might cry. But instead she looked at Sophie, and her granddaughter's smile told her everything she needed to know. They let the quiet settle for a moment, the three of them bound by what they had faced together, and what they still must do. It was Sophie who finally broke the silence, voice gentle but firm. "Grandma, I know things have been hard. I know you must feel like you're fighting alone, but you're not. I want to stay with you, help you, not just until things calm down, but for good. I want to make the manor a place people remember for the right reasons. I want to be part of that. I want to carry on everything you and Grandpa built." Evelyn's heart ached, but with pride this time. She took Sophie's hand and squeezed it. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know." She glanced at Daniel, a question trembling on her lips. "Do you remember Henry?" she asked. "My Henry." Daniel nodded, smiling softly. "He came to my father's funeral, you know, brought lilies from your garden. He said, we measure a life not in years or dollars, but in what we leave behind. I never forgot that." Evelyn let herself drift back just for a moment to the early days, the laughter echoing through sun-dappled rooms, Henry's warm hand in hers, the feeling that anything was possible if they faced it together. She remembered the lean years when they scrimped to keep the house, how Henry worked 2 jobs, but always came home with a smile and a story for Sophie, a kiss for Evelyn. She remembered, too, the lessons he'd taught her, lessons about dignity, about never letting fear or shame dictate your worth. He always said this house wasn't just walls and floors. Evelyn said, voice thick with memory. He said it was a promise that no matter what happened, our family would have a place to come home, to a place built on respect and love, not money. I forgot that for a while. I let myself be afraid, but not anymore. The three of them sat in a circle of sunlight, each lost in thought, each tethered to the other by something stronger than blood. Daniel spoke at last, practical and kind. "I'll file everything first thing tomorrow. We'll let the authorities know what's happened. I'll keep copies of everything locked safe. For now, you focus on getting better." He stood, then hesitated, looking to Sophie. "Take care of her, Sophie. She's a force of nature, but even a hurricane needs rest. Sophie laughed, brushing a tear from her cheek. I will, Daniel. Thank you for everything. After Daniel left, Evelyn rested her head back against the pillow, eyes fluttering shut. For the first time in weeks, she let herself sleep deeply without fear. Her dreams filled with the scent of lilies and the echo of Henry's laughter. When she woke, Sophie was reading by the window, her face serene. Evelyn cleared her throat, and Sophie looked up. I've been thinking, Evelyn said. It's almost my birthday, isn't it? Sophie grinned. 77 next week. What about it? Evelyn smiled, a gleam in her eye that Sophie hadn't seen in years. I want to have a party. A big one. Invite everyone, neighbors, friends, the whole town if they'll come. I want people to remember this house as a place of joy, not just scandal. Will you help me plan it? Sophie's answer was a fierce hug, one that said more than words ever could. They spent the afternoon sketching plans, names to invite, old recipes, to revive flowers to fill every corner. Sophie insisted on making the invitations herself, painting blue irises around each name. Evelyn even phoned Mrs. Hamilton, who promised to rally the other ladies for baking and decorations. By dusk, the hospital room was alive with the anticipation of something more than survival, of renewal, of celebration, of defiance in the face of everything that had tried to break them. Linda visited once, lingering in the doorway, her expression guarded. She left quickly, unwilling to meet her mother's gaze. Kevin didn't come at all. Evelyn noticed their absence, but for the first time she did not mourn it. She had Sophie. She had Daniel. She had the memory of Henry, as real as sunlight, as sure as the promise that lived within these walls. As the sky turned lavender and the nurses made their rounds, Evelyn let herself imagine the party laughter spilling out onto the porch, children chasing fireflies in the garden, the old piano ringing out a waltz. She pictured herself standing tall, surrounded by friends and family, some lost, some found again, reminding everyone that the measure of a life was not in what you owned, but in what you gave, what you built, and whom you loved. That night, Evelyn Tran slept without fear, her mind already planning the celebration that would mark not only her birthday, but the reclaiming of her home, her dignity, and her legacy. This would not be the end of the story. Not by far. For the first time in a long time, the fire in her heart burned bright, promising that the best was yet to come. The Tran manor had never glowed the way it did that night. Lights streamed from every window, lanterns swung from the wide porch, and 100 voices drifted on the warm air over Blue Springs Village. Evelyn Tran's 77th birthday had become the event of the year, a celebration so joyous that even the skeptics, old men who hadn't been to the manor in decades, young mothers juggling toddlers, couldn't resist coming. Children chased one another through the hydrangea beds, their laughter weaving between the clink of glasses and the strains of a waltz from the upright piano in the living room. Tables overflowed with food, savory stews, platters of roasted vegetables, trays of Sophie's lemon cookies, and Mrs. Hamilton's famous pies. Old friends toasted Evelyn, telling stories that drew laughter and tears in equal measure. In every corner of the house, neighbors found reasons to linger, eyes drawn again and again to the birthday woman, the lady of the manor, regal in midnight blue, her silver hair pinned up her gaze, as steady as the mountains that ringed the town. Through it all, Evelyn moved like a queen in her own castle. Every handshake and smile, a small reclaiming of power. Every memory shared a thread, stitching her world together again. She saw the awe in people's eyes, the respect, but also something else, a question unspoken about the rumors that had swirled through Blue Springs these past months. They came for the party, yes, but also for the spectacle, the whispers of family rift, the sight of her children who had not darkened her doorway since she left the hospital. Kevin Tran and Linda Tran arrived late, as Evelyn had known they would. Their entrance was calculated, Kevin in a tailored navy suit, Linda in a crimson dress, both with smiles as bright and brittle as ice under morning sun. They moved among the guests with the ease of politicians, shaking hands, dropping compliments, acting as if their place at the head of the family was never in doubt. "We're so happy to see everyone here," Kevin announced, voice smooth as silk, clapping old Mr. Finch on the back. "It means the world to our mother. She's always said Blue Springs is the heart of our family." Linda echoed him, her laughter a little too loud, her gaze sliding away whenever someone mentioned Evelyn's illness. They posed for photos, gracious in the face of curiosity, but their eyes kept darting to the head of the table where Evelyn presided with Sophie at her side, and Daniel Huang just behind her, a quiet shadow, with the calm of a man who knew how the night would end. Sophie felt the nerves rise and fall in her stomach like the tide. She had spent days with her grandmother planning every detail, who would sit where, when the toasts would be made, how the cake would be brought out. She had painted the invitations chosen, the flowers made sure every guest felt welcome. She also knew what was coming, the secret Evelyn carried in the leather folder tucked beneath the piano bench. Sophie watched her father and aunt, wondering if they sensed the trap closing in, or if they truly believed they'd won. The evening unspooled like a fairy tale. There were speeches, gentle, grateful words from friends, tributes from neighbors whose children Evelyn had taught to read. There was music and dancing, Daniel leading the first waltz, the village's oldest couple following after. For a while, even Evelyn let herself believe in the happiness, in the power of community, to wash away old hurts. But beneath the laughter, the questions lingered. Some guests whispered that Kevin and Linda seemed oddly tense, that they watched each other more than their mother. Others noted the way Daniel Huang never left Evelyn's side, how he accepted every cup of tea but drank little. When the piano fell quiet and the last plate was cleared, Evelyn's birthday cake was carried out, a towering confection crowned with 77 candles, a sea of gold and white flickering in the darkened dining room. All eyes turned to Evelyn as Sophie took her hand. "Make a wish, Grandma." Evelyn's gaze swept the room. Her friends, her neighbors, her enemies. She saw Henry's portrait over the fireplace, saw Daniel's reassuring nod, saw Sophie's silent courage. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and blew out every candle. Applause erupted, glasses raised, children squealed. But Evelyn did not cut the cake. Instead, she reached for the leather folder, and with hands that did not tremble, tapped a spoon against her water glass. "If I could have your attention, please," Evelyn said, her voice carrying through the hush. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Blue Springs has always been my home, and you are my family, every one of you. You have supported me through hardship and joy, and I am grateful." She paused, watching Kevin's smile tighten, Linda's eyes narrow. "But there are things I must say, truths I can no longer keep to myself. My birthday is a celebration of life, but it should also be a reckoning, a chance to set things right. Tonight I want to share with you the full story of this house and the people who would see it lost." A ripple moved through the guests' curiosity, crackling. Evelyn opened the folder. "Many of you have heard rumors about my health, about my intentions, about my children. I want you to hear the truth from me." She began calmly but with force. She described the pressure Kevin and Linda had placed on her to sell the manor, the forms they tried to sneak past her, the anger when she refused. She revealed the missing family heirlooms, the late-night arguments, the relentless demands for money. She spoke, too, of the heartbreak she felt as a mother, watching her own children put greed before love. Kevin tried to laugh it off. "Mother, really, this isn't the time." Evelyn's gaze cut him down. "This is exactly the time, Kevin. I have proof." She handed Daniel the folder. He stepped forward, reading aloud, bank statements with transfers to casinos, emails with forged signatures, a signed affidavit from Mrs. Hamilton, voice recordings from Sophie's recovered drive. The room went silent. Every face turned to Kevin and Linda, who stood frozen, the facade gone. Kevin's cheeks flushed red, his jaw clenched. Linda stared at the tablecloth, her hands twisting in her lap. "Everything I say tonight is supported by evidence. Evelyn continued, voice unwavering. "I have done nothing but try to protect this home for all of us. But my children, my own children, would have sold it for their debts, leaving nothing behind but dust and regret." A gasp rippled through the room. Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand, tears bright in her eyes. "I do not bring this up to shame anyone, but to tell the truth," Evelyn said, her voice cracking at last. "Because only by telling the truth can we be free of it. I hope you will remember not my pain, but my choice to stand up to fight for what is right. For my husband, for Sophie, for Blue Springs itself." Kevin started to protest, words stumbling. "She's exaggerating. None of that's true. She's confused. She's old." Daniel's voice cut through his protest. "The law doesn't see confusion, Mr. Tran, only facts." A beat of silence. Linda's shoulders sagged, the last of her composure slipping away. "We're sorry, Mother," she whispered so quietly only those at the table could hear. Evelyn met her daughter's gaze, pain and pride mingling in her eyes. "I hope one day you'll forgive yourselves." Around them, the guests sat stunned murmurs, rising neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring with open anger at Kevin and Linda. The legend of the Tran family had shattered in a single night, its secrets spilled out for all to see. As the party wound down, some guests offered Evelyn their quiet support, a squeeze of the hand, a whispered promise. Others simply drifted away, unwilling to look Kevin or Linda in the eye. No one asked for cake. The candles guttered in the emptying room, the manor's walls ringing with a new kind of silence. But Evelyn did not feel alone, not anymore. She stood beside Sophie Daniel at her side, knowing that this reckoning, however painful, had set her free. And outside in the dark, Blue Springs was still listening, forever changed by a woman's courage to tell the truth, no matter what it cost. The silence that hung in the manor after Evelyn's revelations was heavier than stone, stretching thin and taut as the last stunned guests remained glued to their seats. Kevin Tran's hands shook on the edge of the table, eyes darting from Daniel's folder to his mother's unyielding face. Linda's lips were pressed together, the color drained from her usually impeccable features. All the lightness, the self-assurance they wore like armor was gone, shattered by evidence and the naked weight of truth. The guests still gathered in little clusters around the living and dining rooms, barely whispered. Some stood in the doorways, arms folded, watching as the Tran siblings struggled to keep their dignity in the blaze of scrutiny. At first, Kevin tried to rally, desperate to salvage something. "This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered, the bravado gone from his voice. She's been under stress and Daniel is twisting things. That thumb drive, who knows who put those files there?" Linda leaned in, voice trembling with urgency. "We never meant to hurt anyone. We were worried about Mom's health. We wanted to make sure she was taken care of, that's all. You know how hard it is for a woman her age alone in a house this size." But her voice broke the excuse, withering under the hard gazes of old neighbors, childhood friends, and former students who remembered Evelyn as a pillar of Blue Springs. The evidence was undeniable, the signatures too precise, the transactions too damning. You wanted to take care of your mother by forging her name, by selling the house she built. Mrs. Hamilton's husband, always quiet at gatherings, stepped forward, shaking his head. "We all heard the rumors, but I didn't want to believe it." A wave of murmurs swelled in the room, the town's judgment rolling in relentless. Another neighbor, a mother whose children Evelyn had once tutored, spoke up. "You pressured her to sign, tried to trick her. That's not care, that's betrayal." The words hit Kevin and Linda like blows. Kevin's mouth opened, then closed. His arguments dried up in the face of the evidence, his mother's pain, and the chorus of disappointment all around. Linda, desperate, turned on her brother, her voice rising. "This was your idea, Kevin. You're the one who lost money at the casino, who brought those men to the house. You told me it was just a loan, that Mom would be safer if we handled everything." Kevin shot back, anger rising. "Don't you dare pin this all on me. You wanted the money too. You're the one who said Mom was losing her mind, who kept asking about the deed. You were in it as deep as I was." Their argument echoed through the manor, no longer masked by secrecy or sibling loyalty. Years of buried resentment, of silent deals and unspoken bargains, exploded in front of the entire village. The guests watched in growing shock and increasingly in disgust. At the edge of the room, Daniel Huang quietly made a phone call. His words were calm, but his eyes were hard. "Yes, Chief, it's time. The evidence is clear. Bank records, emails, witness statements. I'll bring it by the station tonight. I believe there are also missing antiquities, family heirlooms. Yes, possible fraud, attempted sale of property without the owner's consent, abuse of fiduciary duty. No, Mrs. Tran is safe for now. Thank you, Chief. We'll cooperate fully." The weight of the investigation fell into the room like a sudden storm. Word spread quickly. Blue Springs was the kind of place where secrets didn't last, and this one was now too big to hide. A police cruiser appeared at the curb not long after two officers stepping inside, hats in hand, asking quietly to speak to Kevin and Linda. Kevin turned gray, slumping in his chair. "I can explain this is all a mistake. I just needed a little time to get back on my feet. I was going to pay her back. Sir, please come with us. We have some questions." The officer's voice was gentle but final. Linda stood swaying. "Please, I just wanted to help my family. I never thought it would come to this." Her voice was lost in the sea of staring faces. As the siblings were led into the foyer, the murmurs turned to quiet, angry condemnation. How could they do that to their own mother? All that ambition for what they were never like her. Never. Evelyn, who had watched the confrontation with silent, trembling hands, felt the tears begin to fall. She pressed a hand to her lips, shoulders shaking, the pain of betrayal washing over her in waves. This was not the justice she'd wanted, not the public humiliation of her children, not the spectacle of police lights reflecting off the windows she had washed for 40 years. Sophie moved to her side, arms encircling Evelyn's shoulders, holding her upright as the world seemed to tilt. "You did the right thing, Grandma," she whispered fiercely. "You stood up for yourself, for Grandpa, for our family. That's what matters." Evelyn sobbed once, then steadied herself, drawing a shaky breath. "I never wanted this, Sophie. I only wanted them to remember what we built, what mattered. But they forgot." Her voice broke again, the ache of a lifetime's hope turning to dust. Daniel approached, resting a reassuring hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest part of the truth is that it leaves scars. But you did what you had to do. They made their choices. Now everyone knows." The guests were silent, watching the scene, some with tears, some with anger, but none with pity. There was beneath the shock and the sadness a growing respect for Evelyn's courage, for her willingness to endure heartbreak, to defend what was right. Sophie's straightened voice, clear and strong, addressing the room. "This house isn't just a building, and our family isn't just a name. It's about love, about the people who stand by you when things are hardest. My grandmother has given everything for us, and tonight she stood up not just for herself, but for all of us, for what family should mean." She met the eyes of her father and aunt, her voice trembling with both grief and resolve. "If you can't see that, maybe you never really knew her at all." A ripple of agreement swept the guests' applause, hesitant at first, then strong and genuine. Evelyn stood straighter, supported by Sophie, the weight of her pain no longer hers to bear alone. The police officers led Kevin and Linda to the door. Their heads bowed the stares of their former friends and neighbors, following them out into the night. Their reputations, once so carefully cultivated, lay in ruins. Their names, spoken in shame and sorrow, would not soon be forgiven or forgotten. But in the center of the manor, where the candles still flickered and the old piano gleamed, Evelyn and Sophie stood together, joined by Daniel and the friends who remained. Through her tears, Evelyn managed a smile, small, trembling, but real. She had lost much, but she had gained something too, the knowledge that truth could be spoken, that wounds could begin to heal, and that a single act of courage could change the course of a life and a family forever. Outside the village of Blue Springs was quiet, the night thick with the murmurs of hard lessons and the fragile hope of new beginnings. The old manor had survived another storm, its heart battered but at last unbroken. The manor, once filled with secrets and sorrow, had taken on a new electric energy in the weeks after Evelyn Tran's birthday. The dust of scandal had barely settled when workers began to arrive at dawn, their laughter and the clang of tools echoing through the old halls. Windows that had been shuttered for years were thrown open to the sunlight. Paint cans and books replaced piles of unopened mail. Each morning Evelyn watched from her favorite armchair as new life seeped into every crumbling corner of her beloved home. Word spread quickly in Blue Springs Evelyn Tran was giving away her house. It began with a gathering on the porch, a morning just after the police cruiser had driven Kevin and Linda out of town. The siblings' shoulders hunched, eyes averted from the neighbors who no longer called their names. Blue Springs was not a place that forgave easily, not when betrayal came from within. There would be no more invitations to Sunday dinner, no more polite smiles at the market. For Kevin and Linda, exile began not with the law, but with silence. By the time the moving van pulled away, their absence was barely spoken of, as if the town had decided they'd never really belonged. But Evelyn, now leaning on Sophie's arm, was determined not to let her own story end with loss or shame. That morning she invited the town council, local families, and all the children who played in the manor's gardens to hear her speak. She stood at the top of the steps, voice clear and proud, her silver hair gleaming in the sun. "I have lived in this house for nearly 50 years, she began, her words carrying across the crowded lawn. It has been a place of joy and heartbreak, laughter and regret. It sheltered my family, and it witnessed their failures. But more than anything, it was built on a promise my husband and I made long ago to make this world better for those who would come after us." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I have seen what happens when we lose sight of that promise, but I have also seen the power of hope, of second chances. I have seen it in my granddaughter Sophie, who stood by me when others did not. I have seen it in this community, in the faces of the children who remind me every day why we must keep building, even when it hurts." She reached for Sophie's hand. "So today I am giving this house to you, all of you. The Tran Manor will become the Blue Springs Community Center for Children. It will be a place of learning, of laughter, of refuge for any child in need. Sophie will lead it, and Daniel Huang will advise her. And I will spend whatever days I have left ensuring that no child here ever feels unwanted, unworthy, or unloved." A stunned hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the soft sob of a young mother, her hand pressed to her mouth. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for trusting me with your dream. I promise I'll honor it, and you." Daniel, dignified in his neat suit, smiled warmly. "We'll do this together, Sophie. You have my word." Almost overnight, the transformation began. The manor's parlor became a library, its shelves packed with books donated by neighbors and friends. The ballroom, once reserved for holiday parties, was fitted with long tables and art supplies. Volunteers repainted the upstairs bedrooms, turning them into reading rooms, study corners, and a little sanctuary for children with nowhere else to go after school. Out in the gardens, new swings and slides appeared, laughter rising every afternoon like a hymn. The very air of Blue Springs seemed lighter. The village changed by the simple joy of purpose. Children arrived every day, some shy, some wild, some clutching stories no one else had cared to hear. Sophie greeted them all, learning each name, coaxing out their gifts. She became their teacher, their champion, their friend. And Evelyn, her health fragile, but her spirit unbreakable, presided over it all, reading to the littlest ones, planting new flowers along the walk, sharing the old recipes that had comforted generations. Daniel was never far away, his sharp mind and steady hand steering the paperwork, grants, and red tape that threatened to choke Evelyn's dream. He met with the mayor, filed the trust documents, helped Sophie draft lesson plans and volunteer guides. On Saturday mornings he arrived with coffee and donuts for the staff, telling stories of his own childhood in Blue Springs, reminding them all that every success began with the courage to risk something precious. The past was not forgotten. There were some who still whispered about the Tran scandal, who eyed Evelyn and Sophie with a mixture of admiration and wariness. But those whispers faded as the weeks passed, and the laughter of children replaced them. A new story took root not of greed or betrayal, but of generosity, resilience, and renewal. On the day the first mural was finished, painted by the children themselves, bright with sunflowers and handprints, Evelyn stood beneath it, her hands wrapped around Sophie's, her heart full. She saw the village gathering, felt their joy, their cautious pride, their relief at a future reclaimed from the edge of ruin. As dusk fell, the manor shone brighter than ever before. Lights glowed in every window, music spilled into the street, and the garden filled with the kind of laughter that forgives, that heals, that builds something beautiful from the wreckage. Evelyn closed her eyes and listened Henry's voice echoing in her mind. We measure a life not in years or dollars, but in what we leave behind. Blue Springs was changed, and in the heart of the village the manor was alive again, not as a fortress, but as a beacon, proof that even after the fiercest storms new joy could bloom. And for the first time in many, many years, Evelyn Tran felt not only at peace, but truly deeply happy. It was a Saturday that dawned with the promise of something new. Sunlight washed over the freshly painted windows of the old Tran Manor, now the Blue Springs Community Center for Children, while laughter and excited voices echoed down the lane, calling neighbors from their porches and kitchens to see what the future looked like in the hands of the village's children. Inside Evelyn, Tran was up before anyone, her favorite blue dress, crisp, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes bright with anticipation. All morning she moved from room to room, checking every detail: the book display in the reading nook, the crafts table with its rainbow of crayons, the pantry where trays of sandwiches waited for eager hands. She could hear Sophie out in the garden, her laughter mixing with the squeals of children, and felt her heart expand with gratitude and pride. This was the day they had been planning for weeks, the first official event of the new community center. An open house filled with games, stories, and music. Daniel Huang arrived early, sleeves rolled, balancing boxes of art supplies and soccer balls as he grinned at Evelyn. "Looks like a full house out there already, Mrs. Tran." She smiled, taking his arm for balance as they walked toward the front porch, where Sophie was greeting families at the door. "You did this," Daniel said quietly, his voice warm. "You turned loss into something lasting." Evelyn's eyes sparkled. "We did this, all of us. I just stopped being afraid." Children flooded through the manor's great hall, drawn to every room. In the library, little ones sat cross-legged around Evelyn as she read from an old beloved storybook, her voice carrying the gentle wisdom of generations. In the kitchen, Sophie showed older kids how to frost cupcakes. Outside, Daniel coached a soccer match on the sunlit lawn, his laughter ringing as loud as the children's. Neighbors came in waves, some with gifts, flowers, books, baked bread, others with nothing but their open hearts. Old rivalries seemed to melt away in the warmth of the occasion. For hours the house thrummed with possibility, the walls reverberating not with secrets, but with hope. It was halfway through the day when Evelyn noticed them, two figures, lingering at the far edge of the crowd, apart from the celebration. Kevin and Linda stood together beneath a maple tree, their faces lined with sorrow and shame, eyes searching for something they could not find. They didn't cross onto the lawn, didn't approach the house, just stood in the shifting light, watching as their mother and daughter built the future from what remained. Evelyn's gaze lingered on them for a moment. She felt the ache of loss, the familiar wish for reconciliation. But she did not wave them over, did not call their names. This new beginning was not for them, not yet. Healing, she had learned, required truth and time. Later, as afternoon sun turned the gardens golden, Evelyn walked the winding paths behind the manor greeting children as they skipped past listening to their stories and dreams. She knelt beside a little boy, helping him tie his shoelace, and listened as a shy girl described the picture she'd drawn for the mural. In every interaction, Evelyn offered encouragement, kindness, and a gentle reminder. You matter. You're stronger than you know. This place is yours too. Some children asked her about the house, its secret rooms, and old legends. Evelyn told them stories of Henry, of her childhood, of the village, long before their parents were born. She spoke of mistakes and forgiveness, of the importance of choosing kindness when life tempts you toward resentment. Her words settled in the young listeners like seeds destined to bloom long after the day was done. In the shade of the willow, Daniel and Sophie watched Evelyn, their hearts full, Sophie beaming with a kind of hope that shimmered through her. Every word. Asked, "Do you think we're really making a difference?" Daniel smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You already have. But you have to keep going, Sophie. The hardest part isn't starting something new, it's keeping the fire alive day after day. That's where real change happens, and you're not alone." Sophie nodded determination, lighting her face. "I want to build something that lasts for Grandma, for all of them, for us." "That's exactly what you're doing," Daniel said softly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As dusk crept in, the children gathered for one last song on the front steps, their voices bright against the falling night. Evelyn stood beside Sophie, and Daniel, hands clasped, her eyes shining, as she took in the scene laughter music, the murmur of neighbors united by something more enduring than scandal, by the simple radical act of caring for one another. For a long moment, Evelyn let the feeling wash over her, the pride, the relief, the joy. She remembered the years of struggle and loss, the pain of betrayal, the countless nights when she feared her life's work would crumble to dust. Now, watching the future come alive before her, Evelyn Tran understood her legacy was not bricks or money or even the house itself. It was the light she'd kindled in others, the fire Sophie would carry forward, the hope now etched into every wall, every heart. She stood a little taller, smiled a little wider, and let herself believe finally fully that her life had mattered. And as night descended on Blue Springs, the manor glowed from within a beacon of all that could be healed and rebuilt for generations to come. Dawn unfurled gently across Blue Springs, gilding the rooftops with gold, and painting the old Tran manor in a soft, forgiving light. The world was newly washed, dew glittered in the grass, and the garden outside the manor, once choked by neglect, now glowed with the wild, joyous colors of children's art and freshly planted sunflowers. Laughter rang through the air, high and clear, as the children of Blue Springs tumbled across the lawn in the earliest rays of morning. Inside, all was peaceful. Evelyn Tran sat beside her favorite window, a faded blue journal open on the sill, her hand curled around a pen. The house around her was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. Footsteps overhead, the distant melody of Sophie's voice, organizing the breakfast line, the slow hush of pages turning in the new library. For once, Evelyn didn't feel the weight of time or loss pressing on her chest. She felt only the quiet, certain glow of contentment. She wrote steadily, the morning sun warming her face, the words pouring out, as though they had always been waiting for this moment. Today the world is new again. I watch children laughing where old ghosts used to roam these halls. I see hope where for so long I felt only fear. If anyone had told me I would live to see such happiness return to these walls, I might not have believed them. But I have learned late in life that every ending is really a beginning, and that forgiveness, not bitterness, is the root of all peace. She paused, setting her pen aside, watching through the window as Sophie, radiant and full of purpose, waved goodbye to her before heading into the garden. Sophie glanced up, their eyes meeting, and for an instant Evelyn saw every generation of her family in that smile. Her mother's courage, Henry's kindness, her own stubborn resolve, all braided together in the young woman striding out into the day. "Have a good day," Grandma Sophie called, her voice like a song carried on the wind. Evelyn pressed her hand to the glass heart swelling. "You too, darling," she murmured a private benediction. Outside, the community was already alive. Neighbors gathered to help with the morning chores. A group of teens painted new benches for the playground, guided by Daniel's steady hand and easy laughter. Parents lingered sharing stories and coffee, their differences softened by the daily ritual of caring for something larger than themselves. Old feuds, once so sharp, seemed to fade with the mist replaced by nods, handshakes, and a new sense of purpose. The manor's bell rang, calling the children to the first lesson of the day, and Evelyn watched them run backpacks, bouncing hair tangled by the breeze. She listened as the house filled with learning, with friendship, with the unforced music of belonging. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting memories come not with sorrow, but with deep, untroubled gratitude. She thought of Henry gone so long and sent a silent thank you into the golden morning. She thought, too, of her children, Kevin and Linda, hoping that one day forgiveness would find them as well. For now she chose to hold only love. She picked up her journal once more, feeling a new strength in her hand, as she wrote her final line for the day. "True happiness comes not from holding on, but from letting go. Not from what we possess, but what we give. Every loss is the seed of new joy, each ending a doorway. We are made whole not by perfection, but by courage, by love, and by forgiveness." Evelyn set down her pen, the page still wet with hope. She rose, taking in the changed house, the changed village, her changed self. Outside, Blue Springs buzzed with laughter, unity, and the unmistakable sense that something precious had been born from the wreckage of old sorrow. She stood for a moment at the open window, breathing in the scent of grass and sunlight, and children's laughter, a new peace settling in her bones. As the morning brightened, she smiled a smile that seemed to light the whole world.